A GREENPOINT Williamsburg Public Affairs presentation. This is Neighborhoods Today.
It's February, so many teachers and schools are celebrating Black History Month. But there are still many misconceptions and misunderstandings about the past, present, and future of this celebration. So today, I thought we'd go back to the beginning. Hi, this is Mike Hines, and I'm a professor here at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, where my work focuses on the history of America's schools. What we now know as Black History Month had its beginnings as Negro History Week, which was invented by the famed historian, educator, and activist Carter G. Woodson in 1926. Negro History Week was a direct challenge to traditional curricula of the time period, which often degraded and dehumanized Black people. Negro History Week was also inextricably linked to Black calls for social and political equality. More than just a chance to talk about a few notable achievements, Negro History Week was a call to action. Although Negro History Week became one of his most widely known interventions, it was only part of Dr. Woodson's efforts to develop, democratize, and disseminate information on Black history. He also pursued this work through the establishment of the Association for Negro Life and History, its journals, the Journal of Negro History and the Negro History Bulletin, and textbooks, speeches, pamphlets, and materials for every grade level from college down to kindergarten. Now, Woodson didn't do this work alone. Moving from idea to reality took the dedication of thousands of Black teachers, most of them women, who were largely responsible for shaping the celebration through their work in the classroom. It also took the work of entire communities, including churches, fraternities and sororities, libraries and lodges, social clubs, and civic organizations. This reflected Woodson's desire to encourage lay people, not just academics, to preserve and present their own histories. As the movement continued to grow, it outstripped the bounds of a single week, and the word Negro, which was outdated by the 1960s, was replaced by a new generation born and raised in the civil rights struggle. Black History Month emerged in its current form during those decades and is still going strong. So, is this celebration still relevant today? Well, it depends on who you ask. Critics charge that the progress we've made from the 1920s to the 2020s has largely made Black History Month irrelevant. Or that worse, singling out Black history is actually counterproductive to broader efforts at inclusion. Although we may have made progress, however, research from the Southern Poverty Law Center and other sources still shows that we are far from our goal of honoring the multiple voices in our classrooms and challenging dominant narratives. At the same time, new and emerging movements for racial justice call out for historical context, which our schools simply fail to provide. Carter G. Woodson himself was cautiously optimistic that students in the future would no longer need Black History Month if we taught in ways that honored and elevated our students and told their stories all year long. But we're not there yet. So Black History Month will continue to be what it always has been, a celebration, a stinging indictment, and a call to action, all in one.
As the story goes, in December of 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to move from the white section of a bus because her feet hurt, launching the famed Montgomery bus boycott. In reality, she was neither in the white section, nor was she too tired to stand. She was simply tired of giving in. And the story doesn't start there. But Rosa Parks' actions brought the crisis to a head, turning the nation's eyes to Montgomery and the issue over to the federal courts.
The mid-50s, the state of affairs in Montgomery was substantially the same as it was throughout the South. There were laws on the books that provided for separation of the races in almost every public situation. And that's all any African American in Montgomery knew anything about. But I realized that it didn't have to be that way.
And that change began on a downtown Montgomery bus the afternoon of March 2nd, 1955, when 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested on her way home from school for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger.
She had been taught that she had a constitutional right. She was not sitting in the section reserved for white people. She had paid her fare just like the white people had paid theirs. We tried her case. He found her to be a delinquent. We appealed that case to the circuit court, and ultimately the case was dismissed.
Rosa Parks was very involved in the Montgomery Improvement Association, the NAACP, and other organizations to advance the rights of African Americans. She was neither quiet nor reserved.
If we were going to solve these problems, she also knew it was going to take lawsuits in order to do it. She didn't know whether she would ever be asked to get up to give up her seat. But if the opportunity presented itself, I felt that she would refuse to give up her seat.
On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boarded a bus here in downtown Montgomery and sat in the colored section. When the white section filled up and she was asked to move, Rosa Parks did just as Claudette Colvin did. She refused and was arrested. The news of her arrest spread quickly, and a few days later, the African American community rallied to commence the Montgomery bus boycott.
The decision was made that we was going to file a lawsuit. So we was claiming federal constitutional rights, and for those rights to be held, it had to be filed in federal court.
The question was how to make a case that you could bring in federal court, and that's what he did with Browder versus Gale.
I had our leaders checking with people to see who had had problems on the buses and letting me know who would be willing to be plaintiffs.
In the months leading up to Rosa Parks' protest, 4 other women were arrested for the same offense. Ordinary people, a widow with 6 children, a secretary, a schoolgirl, and a teenage churchgoer. On behalf of them and others, attorney Fred Gray filed Browder versus Gale, a federal class action lawsuit against Mayor Gale and the city of Montgomery to end segregation on the city's buses.
When Judge Johnson got this case, the chief judge of the circuit would then appoint 2 other judges to the case, and Judge Reeves was appointed and Judge Lynn was appointed.
That case was decided in a 2-to-1 vote with Judge Reeves and Judge Johnson declaring the ordinances and state statutes to be unconstitutional.
Judge Johnson had been raised in a segregated culture. Judge Reeves had been raised in a segregated culture, and not just a segregated culture, but this very culture in Montgomery. And yet, they both rendered this decision, which was essentially counter to the very culture in which they had been raised.
On November 13, 1956, that decision was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court and set precedent for numerous civil rights cases that followed. As a result, the African American community in Montgomery ended the year-long bus boycott.
The decision was based on a provision in the United States Constitution, in particular in the 14th Amendment, that says that persons cannot be denied the equal protection of the law. This means that all of us are entitled to equal protection regardless of our race or our religion or some other impermissible factor.
Little did we know when we started it that what happened in Montgomery has helped to change the landscape of this country. And at least it gives hope and courage to people to say, if the 40,000 African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama could stay off of the buses 382 days, then whatever problems we have, if we work together and make plans together, we may be able to solve those problems too.
I think the Founding Fathers wanted to develop a judiciary that was independent. That's why we were appointed for life. and that could render decisions that were not influenced by either the president or Congress. And it's that independence that allowed the judiciary, in particular the federal judiciary, to carry out the Constitution here in the South.
If we are to get to where we need to be, it's going to have to be federal judges who will be able to decide these cases and not be afraid of what someone may say or what may happen.
Decades after Rosa Parks stood up for her rights as a person of color, she remains an example of how all citizens can assert their rights by turning to the courts, the guardians of the Constitution.
Can kids change the world? It all started with a trip. The year was 1958. A little girl named Ayana Najuma was 7 years old. She and 19 other kids went on a trip far from their home in Oklahoma. They went up north to New York City. In New York, the kids noticed something. White people and African American people could use the same water fountains. They could eat in the same restaurants. They could even sleep next door to each other in hotels. That may not sound strange to you, but it was strange to Ayana and her friends. They were African American kids from the South. At that time, the southern part of our country was segregated. That means that African American people and white people were kept apart. In Oklahoma City, where the kids lived, water fountains had signs that said whites only. African American kids and white kids couldn't go to school together. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants. The kids were amazed at how different New York City was from the South. When they got back to Oklahoma, they said, "Why do we have to live this way?" They knew the way their community was set up was wrong. White people had more rights than African American people. The kids made a plan to fix things. But would it work? The kids decided to get the restaurants to change so that African American people were allowed to eat in them. It could be dangerous to try to do that. Many people would be angry, but the kids were brave. They planned a sit-in. At a sit-in, you sit in a restaurant and ask to be served. You don't leave until you are served. It's a peaceful way to change something that is unfair. The kids went into training with a group of African American adults. In training, these adults taught the kids about nonviolence. They taught them about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many people didn't want African American people to eat in a whites-only restaurant. The kids learned that people would be unkind. The kids learned that they had to stay calm and be peaceful, no matter how badly others behaved. In training, the adults yelled at the kids. They threw water on them. The kids practiced being calm and not yelling back. Soon, they were ready to do their first sit-in. The kids' first sit-in was at the Cat's lunch counter. It was a whites-only restaurant. Ayana went with about 12 other kids. They all wore their best clothes. They went in and sat down. They were polite. Ayana asked for a hamburger and a Coke. The waitress said no. The other customers were angry. They didn't like that African American kids were trying to change the restaurant. They did not want it to be integrated so that everyone was allowed to eat there. The other customers yelled at the kids. They poured ketchup and coffee on them. Ayanna says, "I wasn't scared. I knew I was doing the right thing." The kids didn't yell. They didn't fight. They sat quietly and talked with each other. They had brought magazines and coloring books. At the end of the day, the restaurant closed. The kids had to go. The next day, they went back. They ordered food again. No one gave it to them, but they were not going to give up. They were determined. On the third day, the kids ordered food. This time, the waitress brought it to them. From that day on, the Cat's lunch counter was integrated. Anyone could eat there. The kids were so happy. They had made one place in their community better. Ayanna had learned something. She says, "I was little, but my voice was just as important as everyone else's voice." But their work wasn't done. So many restaurants in their community were segregated. Over the next 6 years, the kids did sit-ins at many restaurants. More and more kids joined each time. The restaurant owners got pretty clever about trying to keep the kids away. At one restaurant, workers took away all the chairs. There was no place to sit. But would that stop the kids? No. Ayanna's little sister Lana had the right idea. When she didn't have a chair to sit on, she just leaned on the table. In most places, people wouldn't let the kids use the bathroom. That wasn't going to stop the kids either. One by one, the kids integrated the restaurants in their town. The kids had changed their city. One small group of kids had made their community better for everyone. They may have been little, but their voices were huge.
Thurgood Marshall, the civil rights crusader, a man who was instrumental in ending legal segregation and later became the first African-American justice of the Supreme Court. In this special series we call Moments in History, we remember a man who challenged our legal system to create a more perfect union and forever change our country. Thurgood Marshall was born in 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. His mother, an educator, and father, a railroad porter, steered Marshall into a law career. After graduating with honors from Lincoln University, Marshall applied to the University of Maryland Law School, but was denied because he was African American. So he traveled for an hour daily to Howard University Law School under the tutelage of a prominent NAACP attorney, Charles Hamilton Houston.
One of the suggestions made to Thurgood Marshall by Charles Hamilton Houston was to go to the deepest South, into those pockets of the country where resistance against equality and desegregation were the toughest, and pay attention to the people, listen to them, hear their stories, and understand that you are working for a cause that's bigger than being a lawyer, bigger than being a law graduate, bigger than even anything you can imagine in your life. And Thurgood Marshall took on that mantle.
In 1934, Marshall graduated magna cum laude from Howard. The following year, he started a private practice and eventually succeeds his mentor, Charles Houston, to become the NAACP's chief counsel. During this time, Marshall systematically dismantles the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that upheld racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. He argued 32 civil rights cases before the Supreme Court, winning 29.
He wanted to establish the building blocks of earlier cases. He didn't want this issue to come up early in the litigation. And I learned a lot about how a person can try to influence the development of an issue over a long period of time.
In fact, it was 13 years before Marshall had a chance to challenge separate but equal with the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. The ruling ended segregation in the U.S. By now, Thurgood Marshall is a household name, but not everyone is in favor of the landmark decision.
It took an enormous amount of guts. He told us the story about how he'd have to move sometimes 2 or 3 times a night from home to home in order to stay safe. He told us the story about how he was very close to being lynched one time. It wasn't just his client, it was he who was in danger.
Justice Marshall was a great admirer of the man I wound up working for, Judge Harold Tyler. And Tyler had been an assistant attorney general in charge of civil rights. One day in the fall of 1960, Marshall was down in New Orleans and was advised that the Klan was coming to get him that very night. He called Tyler, he had Tyler's home number. Within an hour, the FBI picked up Marshall and put him in a secure location and saw him through that. And Marshall credited Tyler with saving his life.
The death threats didn't stop Marshall. After the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, Thurgood continued to defend civil rights demonstrators until he was appointed in 1961 to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Of all his rulings, none were overturned by the Supreme Court, and by 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice.
It was fascinating to see the multiple aspects of his personality, the personable, sociable storyteller, the precise taskmaster, just an amazing and remarkable, unique human being.
What was most delicious about the clerkship were these stories. And they ranged from hanging out with Langston Hughes and Lena Horne, Joe Louis, meeting with Prince Philip, helping draft the Kenyan Constitution. So every single story was like gold.
One of Marshall's favorite stories, and Marshall told stories all the time. Many of them were about race relations, many of them were serious subjects, but he always would tell a story with his booming laugh, and they always had a funny ending, even when he was making a very serious point. All the new judges were supposed to come up for a photo shoot, and the photographer blew a fuse while setting up his equipment. So they called for an electrician. Who should walk into the room next? Thurgood Marshall. The secretary looked up at him and said, "Oh, you must be the electrician." He laughed about the story, and why did he laugh? Because at the time the trade unions in New York were all segregated, and he said, "That woman must be crazy to think that I could be a member of the electricians union in New York City."
By the time I was clerking, was very interested in hiring clerks who wanted to teach. And we were involved in the hiring process. And we asked him, why do you want people who want to teach? And he had a very long view about influence. He was very explicit. He said, of course, I want the smartest people. But he also said, I want people who will pass on the lessons to a next generation.
In 1991, Thurgood Marshall announced he was retiring from the bench.
It came as a complete shock to us. The morning he did it, he called us in and he said, "Well, I've decided to give it up." And I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, I've already sent the letter to the president." There was this part of me who, until he said that, I was going to try to talk him out of it. "No, you can't do this, you can't do it." He had already done it. And as far as I could tell, nobody in his chambers knew.
And when reporters asked him why,
"Well, I'm old. I'm getting old and coming apart."
2 years later, Thurgood Marshall passed away at the age of 84.
Or the day of the funeral, we went to the National Cathedral. President Clinton was there, the Vice President, many senators, all these important Washington people. And at the end, word got around that the law clerks were invited to the burial at Arlington. So we went there, and I assumed that a lot of Washington dignitaries would be there, but that was not the case. And it was the law clerks and the family, and Justice's family was small. And Sissy Marshall at one point turned to us and said, Thurgood regarded you as part of his family. And I guess we knew, and he wanted you to be here for this moment. And that was really wonderful.
What made Thurgood Marshall an exemplary leader, in my view, is that he never stopped having utter empathy for common folk, people who were disadvantaged, and he dedicated his life to using the law to help those folk, regardless of color.
It reinforced my interest in public service. When you have a role model like that, when a person like that who's putting his life on the line in the interest of the ideals, it's very hard to want to do anything other than to find a way to give back. There's almost nothing any of us can do in this generation that rivals the level of commitment and risk that he put on the line, for the causes he believed in.
Today, you can find numerous memorials from coast to coast honoring Justice Thurgood Marshall, from courthouses to national airports, even the building I'm standing in now. For the U.S. courts in the Thurgood Marshall Federal Judiciary Building, I'm Bridget Lyles. Thanks for watching.
That's it for this edition. I'm Dick Mahan for Neighborhoods Today. We hope you'll join us again, and we thank you for watching.